June 9th, 1982. Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, 2 in the morning. There are nights where darkness feels like weather. Something physical. Not just an absence of light, but a weight. The valley is a bowl of black velvet. No moon, no helpful starlight. The hills are silhouettes only because the human mind insists they must be there. Down on the valley floor, a column of Syrian armor moves like a slow iron river. T-72s, Soviet export pride, low, mean profiles, autoloaders, composite armor. The kind of machine that makes generals talk in numbers instead of names. Up on a ridgeline a couple of kilometers away, Soviet advisors watch through optics that suddenly feel old. Their doctrine has a simple comfort to it. If the enemy can't see you, the enemy can't hit you. Night is cover. Night is a shield. Night is the oldest camouflage on Earth. Inside the lead tank, the commander keeps to protocol. His infrared searchlight stays dark. No active beam, no giveaway. Passive night vision, if he has it, won't help much under cloud and dust anyway. But that's fine. The plan isn't to fight tonight. The plan is to move, to reposition, to appear at dawn like a surprise. This is what Soviet manuals promised. Darkness equals safety. Then physics rewrites the manual. A crack splits the night. Not a slow exchange of fire. Not a back and forth. Just one violent punctuation mark. The lead tank doesn't so much get hit as it stops being a tank in the way the crew understood it. Metal flares. The column breaks in bunches like startled animals. On the radios, voices climb into panic. Arabic, fast and high. Where is it coming from? Who's firing? What direction? Turrets swing. Barrels probe the black. The crews do what training always does under stress. It drags your hands to the switches you trust. Infrared searchlights bloom, beams invisible to the naked eye, but bright as headlights through the green-tinted world of Soviet active night sights. The valley should light up inside those scopes. The walls should show. The dust should sparkle. A target should appear. Nothing. The ridgeline stays empty. The horizon stays blank. No muzzle flashes. No tracer arcs. No flares drifting overhead. The enemy isn't illuminating the battlefield. And still the rounds come. Second tank, then third. Not wild guesses. Not area fire. The impacts land with a kind of calm cruelty. Hits that suggest a gunner is not merely detecting shapes, but tracking them, leading them, solving them, at ranges that make night fighting feel like a myth. In 5 minutes, a doctrine begins to die. On the ridgeline, one of the Soviet observers lowers his binoculars, and you can almost see his mind searching for a missing piece of reality. He wants a simple explanation. Searchlights, flares, some obvious trick, something you can point to and say, there, that's why. But the night gives him nothing to point at. By dawn, the advisors walk down into the valley. The air is chalky with smoke and dust. The wrecks are still warm in places, radiating heat into a morning that has no business being quiet. They stare at the punctures in armor, clean, surgical, more like an engineering demonstration than a battlefield accident. They pace off distances, look back toward the western ridges, and feel the numbers tighten around their throats. 2 kilometers, maybe more. At that range, at night, a tank should be a rumor. Even the best starlight scopes, image intensifiers, need photons to amplify. They steal what little light exists and stretch it thin, but in heavy darkness, in dust, in haze, they don't see tanks. They see ghosts, grain, smear, and yet somebody put a round into a moving target like they were swatting a fly. The first reports that go back to Moscow read like superstition wearing a uniform. The advisors reach for explanations that preserve their worldview. Radar-guided guns, buried sensors, ambush teams marking targets. Anything but the obvious idea sitting right there in the word they don't want to say. Heat. The Americans, through Israeli hands, through proxy forces, through whatever chain of politics makes people feel safer, have done something that sounds simple until you try to build it. They've taught a tank to see the world without light. They have stolen the night, not by turning it on, but by refusing to need it. Back in Moscow, the file lands in an intelligence office and gets stamped with the kind of priority reserved for disasters. Because the Bekaa Valley is not just Lebanon. Bekea is a preview. The real nightmare is Europe. If you're the Soviet General Staff in the early 1980s, Europe is a map you've memorized so hard it lives behind your eyelids. East German roads, West German forests, river crossings. The corridors NATO calls gaps, especially the one that keeps showing up in every war game like a loaded gun on a table. Fulda. Your strategy is mass, speed, shock. You throw thousands of tanks forward, day and night, under smoke and weather, and you break NATO before it can breathe. Night fighting isn't a detail. It's a pillar. Darkness is supposed to be the equalizer that turns technology into guesswork. But if the enemy can see in the dark, mass turns into a traffic jam. And a traffic jam turns into a shooting gallery. So, the Kremlin does what large machines always do when something doesn't fit. It sends a team, a technical group from the proving grounds at Kubinka. Engineers, optics specialists, people who don't talk about courage because their job is to measure problems in microns. They fly to Syria. They sift the dust. They map the angles. They hunt for fragments like archaeologists of a catastrophe. They confirm something that makes the story feel worse. The killer wasn't some futuristic prototype. It wasn't a brand new wonder tank. It was an M60, an American design that first rolled into service when Kennedy was still alive. Tall, boxy, a big slab-sided silhouette, the kind of tank Soviet officers had learned to sneer at, obsolete they'd say. Old Western steel made for an older war. If an old tank did this, then the weapon isn't the tank. It's the eye inside it. The files tell them the variant, M60A3. They know about the laser rangefinder. They know about the ballistic computer. Those are serious upgrades, yes, but a computer doesn't help you aim at what you can't see. A laser rangefinder doesn't find a target in pitch black fog. It only measures distance once a target has already been acquired. The question remains like a splinter under the nail. How did they acquire? The Soviets interview a Syrian crewman who got out alive, shaken, soot-stained, voice hollow. He repeats the line that will end up haunting a dozen offices in Moscow. We saw nothing. Not a hint. Not a glimmer. Not even the faint sweep of active infrared. Then he adds one detail that feels childish until it starts rearranging entire budgets. Before the first shot, he heard a hum. Low, steady, mechanical. A sound that didn't belong to wind or engines, like a refrigerator running in the distance. The engineers write it down anyway, because sometimes the future announces itself quietly. The investigation stalls. Recs tell you what happened, but not how. No one finds a magic device lying in the dirt. No captured tank. No intact site to dissect. Only absence. So, the Soviets do the next thing large machines do when they can't steal the answer. They try to prove the answer isn't real. They organize exercises, night fighting drills, evaluations of their own optics. Demonstrations meant not just to test hardware, but to soothe an institution's pride. The Soviet night system is built around a belief. Active infrared is power. The Luna searchlight, paired with a compatible sight, turns blackness into a green-lit landscape. Trees, fence lines, roads appear. You become a hunter while the enemy stays blind. That belief worked, as long as the enemy was truly blind. But what if the enemy isn't blind? Winter, 1983. The border between East and West Germany. Fog rolls over frozen ground like breath from a giant mouth. The kind of fog that erases distance. The kind of fog that makes you lose confidence in your own hearing. A Soviet tank commander sits behind glass and steel, wrapped in the small private warmth of heaters and the constant vibration of an idling engine. Through his passive scope, the world is useless. Grain and murk. No photons to amplify. No detail to steal. So, his hand goes where training has always put it. He flips the switch. The Luna ignites, an invisible beam blasting into the fog. Through his sight, the world pops into being. A ghostly green highway, suddenly real again. He feels, for a moment, like he owns the night. He starts to sweep the beam across the tree line on the western side, searching for shapes that don't belong. Then his radio snaps alive, harsh and urgent. Turn it off. He hesitates, confused. He sees nothing. Turn it off now. The voice isn't calm. It's not advisory. It's the tone people use when they can already see the accident happening. They're looking right at you, and that is the moment the Soviet commander finally understands the hidden price of active infrared. It's not a flashlight you hold, it's a sign over your head. Every time your beam moves, you are drawing a line through the fog that somebody else, somewhere, can track like a finger tracing a map. Every sweep says, "Here I am, here is my turret, here is my face." He freezes and forces his eye back into the sight. Deep in the tree line, barely there, is a shape that shouldn't make sense in this fog. Low, hulking, still, not shining, not searching, just sitting like a piece of night that has learned how to wait. An American tank, an M60, no visible light, no infrared beam, no flare, no high beams in the darkness, and yet the gun tube is pointed straight at him. He nudges his own turret. The American turret nudges with him. He moves left. It mirrors left. He moves right. It mirrors right, not delayed, not hesitant, like a predator tracking a heartbeat. Suddenly the fog feels thinner, not because he can see more, but because he realizes someone else can. Someone else is reading the world in a spectrum his doctrine never truly respected. He kills the Luna and orders reverse, backing down behind a rise of frozen earth. Only when the beam is gone does the terrible intimacy of that moment land in his chest. He didn't survive because his armor held. He survived because he stopped talking in infrared. Back in Moscow, the panic arrives in pieces. Not one dramatic report, but a stack of consistent ones. Border incidents, training anomalies, gunners complaining that smoke doesn't work the way it should, commanders swearing that NATO can track them without illumination. The easy explanation is sabotage, spies, traitors in design bureaus, somebody stealing blueprints. It's comforting to blame humans because humans can be arrested. But the truth is colder. The truth is that the enemy didn't steal your tank. The enemy stole your assumptions. And somewhere inside that American turret, behind armor and wiring and a panel held shut with bolts, there is a box that hums like a refrigerator, quietly cooling a detector down toward temperatures that belong to laboratories, not battlefields. If that box is real, then the next question isn't, can they see? The next question is, how far? Because if they can hit you from 2 kilometers away in darkness and fog, without giving away their position, then the first minutes of any war in Europe won't be a clash. They'll be an autopsy. And that is exactly what the Soviet technical services decide they must learn. Even if learning it means looking directly at a future, they have no tools to stop. They don't need to capture an M60. They need to capture the secret inside its eyes. And the first time they get close enough to hear that hum clearly, close enough to identify what kind of machine could possibly make it, the Cold War shifts in a way the public will never see. Because the next file that lands on a desk in Moscow won't describe a battle. It will describe a sound, a high, tightening whine, as if a tiny turbine is spinning up inside the tank. And the man reading it will understand instantly what that means. A refrigerator, miniaturized, sealed, running on the tank's own power. The night is no longer a place to hide. It's a place where you glow. End of part 1-3. A refrigerator, miniaturized, sealed, running on the tank's own power. And in that moment, the Soviet specialist doesn't feel anger first. He feels vertigo. Because a refrigerator inside a tank turret isn't a gadget. It's a declaration that the Americans have solved a problem the Soviets have been politely avoiding for years. You can't do serious thermal imaging on a moving, vibrating, mud-covered fighting vehicle unless you can tame the detector. Unless you can drag it down into the cold, where tiny differences in heat stop being noise and become edges. In Soviet laboratories, cooling is a ritual. Liquid nitrogen, frost on glass, fragile setups that look like scientific poetry. On a battlefield, cooling is supposed to be impossible. Vibration alone should shatter delicate crystals. Dust should blind mirrors. Shock should kill calibration. A turret is not a clean room. A tank is not a microscope. Yet the report describes a sound, high, tight, mechanical, like a little turbine winding up inside armor. And that sound has a name, even if the file doesn't say it. A closed-cycle cooler, a tiny machine that takes helium and pressure and time and turns them into cold over and over, without refilling flasks, without trucking cryogens forward, without begging logistics for miracles. It's not romantic technology. It's not cinematic. It's brutally practical. It means the eye never gets tired. As long as the tank has power, the detector stays cold. As long as the detector stays cold, the picture stays sharp enough to kill. And now, the question shifts again. It always shifts because fear is a staircase. If the Americans can see heat, what exactly do they see? Because every general in Moscow has held a civilian thermal viewer at some point, captured, purchased, traded for favors. The image is always the same story: fuzzy blobs, ghosts, useful for spotting a warm vehicle in a field, maybe. Useful for finding a man at close range, but not for precision gunnery, not for sniping weak points, not at 2 kilometers. So, the Soviet High Command does what it always does when reality threatens pride. It argues. In rooms that smell of cigarette smoke and cold tea, senior designers and officers stand over diagrams and swear the Americans are bluffing. Maybe they're using radar. Maybe they're using acoustic sensors. Maybe they've built a clever trick into the rangefinder. Maybe they have ground teams with laser pointers. Maybe it was luck in Lebanon. Maybe the border reports are exaggeration. Maybe. Because the alternative is too clean, too cold, too final. If the Americans have a true thermal sight, rugged, stabilized, cooled, then night is not cover. Night is exposure. And exposure kills doctrine. So, they test. They acquire a Western commercial thermal camera, something meant for electricians and power lines and factory inspections. They look through it at a tank on a range. The image is soft, smeared, full of grain. Someone laughs, relieved. See? That's all thermal is. Blobs. But the laughter dies quickly because the people in the room who are truly dangerous, the engineers, don't laugh at the image. They stare at it like it's a shadow of a real thing. Civilian thermal viewers are built to be cheap, to be safe, to be general purpose. They don't have to read a target at 2 kilometers. They don't have to survive shock and recoil. They don't have to feed a ballistic computer with clean, stable target geometry. A tank sight does. A tank sight is not a camera. It's a weapons nervous system. And somewhere, inside American industry, someone has found a detector material that behaves differently. An exotic compound that doesn't just notice heat, it distinguishes it. It separates a warm engine block from warm ground. It draws edges where Soviet systems see fog. In the thermal spectrum, the world is not dark. It is layered. A tank is not a silhouette. It is a map of temperature. The exhaust grills glow hottest. The road wheels warm as they roll. The gun barrel changes after firing. A turret front holds heat differently than a hull side. A human head in an open hatch is a small, bright coin against a colder sky. It's not magic. It's physics. And physics doesn't care what your doctrine says. The most terrifying part is how ordinary it feels once you accept it. Once you stop asking, how can they? And start asking, why wouldn't they? Everything above absolute zero radiates energy. Everything. A tank at idle is a furnace. A man is a lantern. A freshly driven track is a warm scar across the earth. The Soviets have spent decades teaching themselves to think in steel. Armor thickness, gun caliber, silhouette, speed. The Americans are teaching themselves to think in spectra. And that is the true ambush. Not in Lebanon, not on the German border. Inside the mind. In panic, the Soviet system reaches for counters. If you can't match the eye, maybe you can hide from it. Maybe you can turn a tank into a rock. They cover vehicles with rubberized mats. They reroute exhaust through baffles. They insulate. They paint. They experiment with materials that promise miracles. Suppress heat. Scatter it. Smear it into the background. For a few minutes, sometimes, it looks hopeful. On a cold morning, a covered tank can sit almost invisible until the engine has time to betray it. But thermodynamics is a patient executioner. Heat must go somewhere. The engine produces energy, and the hull is steel, and steel conducts, and the world is honest. The glow returns. First the rear vents, then the wheels, then the turret ring, like a body warming back up after being dragged from snow. The cloak doesn't fail dramatically. It fails inevitably. And then the real horror reveals itself, not in Soviet materials, but in American procedure. Because American thermal sights don't just show one picture, they offer a choice, polarity, white hot or black hot. Heat can be painted bright or painted dark. It sounds like a preference setting, like choosing whether you like a map in day mode or night mode. But on a battlefield, it becomes a knife. If a tank is slightly warmer than the forest behind it, it shows clearly in one polarity. If the background shifts, sun-warmed trees, a city wall holding heat, a desert floor cooling under smoke, the gunner flips polarity and the contrast snaps back into place. The world is re-edged instantly. You can't camouflage against both polarities at once. Whatever trick you use to blend in becomes the thing that outlines you when the switch is flipped. This is the kind of detail that makes a strategist's stomach go cold. Because it doesn't require a new tank. It doesn't require a new round. It requires a trained finger. Flip. And the hidden becomes obvious. Now add the second Soviet reflex, smoke. Every Soviet tank commander learns it early. If you're engaged, pop smoke. Break line of sight. Force the enemy to lose you. Retreat, reposition. It's survival. It's muscle memory. So Soviet testers fire smoke grenades in front of a vehicle and watch it disappear to the naked eye. They watch it vanish through ordinary optics. They nod, satisfied, then they look through thermal. And the smoke is not a wall, it's a veil. Visible smoke is designed to block visible light. That's what it's for. It's a chemical trick against human eyes and glass scopes. But thermal sees in a different band. Long-wave infrared doesn't care about your gray cloud the same way visible light does. In many cases, the smoke doesn't stop it. It barely slows it. What looks like a solid barrier to a human becomes a thin curtain to the sensor. Worse, smoke can cool slightly compared to the surroundings. It becomes a smooth, uniform background, a stage backdrop. Against that backdrop, the hot tank stands out more sharply than before. So, the Soviet get-out-of-jail button becomes a frame-yourself-for-the-shot button. The defensive reflex becomes a trap. Imagine being a tanker and learning that your training, your instinct, is now a death wish. Imagine being the officer responsible for those training manuals. And now, imagine being the strategist who built an entire European war plan, on night, smoke, and mass. Because this is the moment when the Soviets begin to understand that the West has not simply improved a tank. The West has changed the geometry of battle. Distance becomes cruel again. If you can see a target at 2,500 meters at night, you don't need to close. You don't need to expose yourself. You don't need to trade shots. You can sit in cover and pick. And the Soviet advantage, numbers, turns into a liability. A long column is not a threat. It's a sequence, one after another, a mathematician's dream. So, the Soviet machine scrambles toward desperation solutions. If you can't hide, blind the enemy. Develop warning receivers. Build dazzlers. Shoot back at the optics. Create systems that can sense a laser rangefinder and answer it with light meant to burn or confuse. It is expensive. It is fragile. It is late. And it has a bitter irony. The Soviets are trying to fight a sensor war with counter-sensors, while the Americans are already training crews to exploit the simplest fact of all: heat is always there. A decade passes like this, mostly invisible to the public. No parades, no speeches, just quiet conversions and whispered briefings. The kind of shift that doesn't make headlines because it's too technical for ordinary fear, but history has a habit of staging its demonstrations where cameras can't avoid it. February 1991, Kuwait. Oil fields burn, and the sky is thick with a black ceiling that turns noon into twilight. Smoke rolls over the sand in layers, oily and heavy, swallowing distance. The air tastes like soot. It sticks to the throat. It makes every breath feel borrowed. For men trained in optical warfare, it's the perfect battlefield. Darkness is safety. Smoke is cover. If you can't see, you can't be seen. In dug-in positions, Iraqi crews sit inside Soviet-made tanks, T-55s, T-62s, T-72s, idling engines low, waiting for shapes to come close enough to kill. They believe in the old rules. They have been taught those rules by advisors and manuals and experience. They listen for engines. They stare into blackness. They wait for the moment when the enemy must finally appear. And over that smoking horizon, the enemy comes. Not in the newest, most glamorous machines the world expects, but in something older looking, almost insulting in its shape. M60A3s, tall, boxy, a relic if you judge by armor lines. But inside one of those turrets, a gunner presses his face to a sight that doesn't care about smoke, or night, or human eyes. On his screen, the world is not black. It is contrast. The smoke overhead is hot. The desert floor below is cooler. The tanks in the sand, engines warm, metal holding heat, announce themselves like bright signatures. A battlefield that looks blind to the naked eye becomes a clean, readable picture. Not perfect, not daylight, but clear enough to aim, clear enough to choose. Through the roar of distant fires and the rumble of tracks, the gunner's voice is calm, almost bored, because calm is what training sounds like when it works. Target, range. The laser pulses, brief, precise, a whisper of measurement. The computer does its cold arithmetic, and the gun settles on a glowing shape in the smoke that the enemy cannot even imagine is visible. The gunner inhales. The trigger is not a dramatic lever. It's a small movement, a fingertip. And as the cannon is about to speak, somewhere inside the turret, a faint mechanical whine rises. Steady, familiar, almost domestic. The sound of a refrigerator, keeping an eye cold enough to turn war into geometry. And that faint whine is the last sound in the universe that cares whether it's day or night. Because the moment the cooler steadies, the picture steadies. The gun speaks. A 105mm round punches forward through the smoke, like it was fired inside a tunnel. For the Marines inside the M60, the recoil is a familiar shove, metal and muscle memory. For the men inside the dug-in Iraqi tanks, it is something else entirely. It is impact without context. A strike from a direction they cannot name, from a distance they cannot measure, delivered through a curtain they believed was a wall. They have been trained to fight the war of silhouettes, see a shape, identify it, range it, fire. But now they are in a war where the enemy doesn't need silhouettes. The enemy needs temperature. The first Iraqi crew that takes the hit doesn't have time to understand. The second crew hears something, thunder in the smoke, and reacts the way soldiers always react when fear bites. They grasp for the lever that promises control. Turrets traverse blindly. Cannons elevate and depress, searching for a target the eyes cannot find. Engines rev, then idle, then rev again. Radios chatter in short bursts. Somewhere someone screams an order to pop smoke, to thicken the curtain, to disappear. And in the old world, that would be smart. In this world, it is a gift. Because a fresh smokescreen is often cooler than the background, a smooth gray sheet in visible light that becomes a clean, uniform canvas in thermal. Behind it, the hot tank becomes a brighter signature, an easier outline. The defenders are not hiding. They are isolating themselves, blinding their own optics, and giving the attacker a perfect backdrop. Inside the M60, the gunner doesn't feel like a hero. He feels like a technician. His sight shows him what the naked eye cannot. The geometry of warm machines in a cold landscape. A tank is not a rumor. It's a luminous object. He can see which engines are running hard and which are cooling. He can see heat pooling under exhaust grates. He can see the difference between a turret face and a hull plate because they hold warmth differently. This is what the Soviet analysts did not want to believe. Thermal isn't only detection. With the right sensor cooled hard enough, thermal becomes identification. Not perfect, not cinematic 4K, but sharp enough to aim with confidence. Sharp enough to choose where to hit. He shifts to the next target. The laser pulses. The computer solves. The barrel settles. Another shot, another impact. The Iraqis fire back into smoke, hoping luck can stand in for sight. Their rounds vanish into the blackness. Somewhere, a shell detonates uselessly in sand. Somewhere another slams into empty air. The defenders are doing everything their training tells them is rational, and it all bounces off a reality they cannot see. This is what technology gap looks like when it becomes transparency gap. One side is fighting inside a sealed room, the other side is looking through glass. And the most brutal part is that the glass is invisible. The fight doesn't feel fair because it isn't structured like a duel. It feels like an execution carried out by people who can see you clearly, while you are forced to guess at their existence. The old rules, night, smoke, weather, have been subtracted from the defender's toolkit and added to the attacker's advantage. When the engagement ends and prisoners are taken, some of the Iraqi tankers look less like defeated soldiers and more like men waking from an impossible dream. They ask the same question again and again, because it is the only question that makes sense in their heads. How did you see us? How could you see anything? The Marines show them the sight, this strange humming box that turns smoke into translucence and darkness into contrast. The reaction isn't just fear, it's grief. It's the realization that courage and armor and discipline were never going to be enough. They were never even playing the same game. Far away, in offices that smell of paper and ash, Soviet analysts read the after-action reality like a confession. They had spent the 1970s and 1980s perfecting steel. Bigger guns, thicker armor, lower profiles, autoloaders, reactive bricks. They had built a theory of war where mass and aggression could cover almost any weakness, but steel is only half a weapon system. The other half is perception, and perception has been stolen. This isn't the kind of defeat you can patch with a new shell type or a slightly better turret cheek. It's not a matter of upgrade this component. It's a matter of admitting that the battlefield itself has changed character. In the old imagination, night was neutral, smoke was neutral, fog was neutral. Now, those things have allegiance. They belong to the side that can read heat. And once that truth sets in, all the earlier moments snap into a single line. Baika Valley wasn't a freak incident. It was a preview. The German border reports weren't paranoia. They were data. The hum wasn't irrelevant battlefield noise. It was the sound of a new century turning on. Somewhere in Soviet design bureaus, men who once argued with certainty now argue with fatigue. They draft counters, better passive sights, their own cooled detectors, new camouflage concepts, exhaust cooling schemes, laser warning systems, dazzlers, anything to restore opacity. But the problem isn't that one American tank can see. The problem is that seeing has become normal. Once you build an eye like that, you don't unbuild it. Once crews train with it, you don't erase the skill. Once commanders plan with it, you don't go back to trusting the dark. So, the Soviet Union is left with a bitter realization that has nothing to do with a single platform name and everything to do with time. For a decade, the last decade when this Cold War might have turned hot, the balance of power in Europe was not what the Soviets believed it was. Their night offensive, the massed rush through gaps, under smoke, in rain and fog, wasn't a nightmare for NATO. It was a target list. Because NATO tanks could sit in forests, engines low, silhouettes swallowed by real darkness, and still watch the approach. They could pick command vehicles by the extra heat of radios. They could wait until the column was deep enough that turning around would be chaos. They could let the doctrine commit itself, and then they could fire, not into darkness, into certainty. That is the tragedy at the core of the story. The Soviet Union spent fortunes to make its tanks harder to kill, and the Americans found a way to kill them without needing to fight them in the old sense. Not by matching armor, but by bypassing it, by seeing first, choosing first, shooting first. It's tempting to tell this as a tale of American genius and Soviet stagnation, but that's too clean. The real lesson is uglier. Because what killed the doctrine wasn't an evil secret, it was a simple fact of the universe. Everything warm speaks, and once you learn to listen in the right spectrum, you can't pretend you don't hear it. The M60 was never supposed to be the glamorous tank. It didn't have the mythology of turbine engines or futuristic angles. It looked like a brute from an earlier era. But when you give a brute a perfect eye, it stops being a brute. It becomes a sniper. And snipers don't need to be pretty. They need to see. So, when people ask why the Cold War ended without Soviet tanks storming across West Germany, there are answers about economics, politics, leadership, ideology, and luck. Those are real. But there's also a quieter answer hidden behind a panel on an old American turret, an answer that hums, steady and domestic, like an appliance in a dark kitchen, a cooler keeping a detector cold enough to turn night into information, a crystal that reads heat like text, a switch that flips polarity and makes camouflage betray itself, a sight that looks through smoke and refuses to be lied to. And if you've ever sat in a truly dark room and felt the comfort of not being seen, then understand what the Soviet tankers began to understand in those years, slowly at first, then all at once. In modern war, darkness is not safety. Darkness is just the place where the other side stops pretending, because if you cannot see, you are already dead. And somewhere out there, in the black, a screen is glowing softly, green, grainy, merciless, showing you in high contrast, while you stare back into nothing.